BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Blackbox Ned. On this episode of Cooper Friday, I will be discussing the book D.B. Cooper and the FBI by Bruce A. Smith. And as you can see from the title of this episode, this is part 1. Instantly, I knew that this was going to be a multi-part discussion. When I read the first page of this book, I knew that this would be too much information for one single episode. You could even call this the introduction episode instead of part 1. I first started Cooper Friday about a year ago, and shortly after I launched this segment, I was contacted by Darren Schaefer, who hosts the podcast, The Cooper Vortex, and he invited me to be a guest on his show. I was talking about the D.B. Cooper books that were on my reading list, and I said that D.B. Cooper and the FBI by Bruce A. Smith was up there, and he said absolutely that would be the go-to book to have for Cooper Friday or for any type of explorations into the D.B. Cooper vortex, if you will, and I completely agree with that. Even as I said from reading the early segments of the book, it is jam-packed with information, so please excuse me for taking a little bit too long to get around to this one, but as you see, there's going to be a multi-part discussion here on Cooper Friday, and let's get started. On November 24th of 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper boarded a flight going from Portland to Seattle, Washington. He opened his briefcase and revealed what appeared to be a bomb to a flight attendant after giving her a note stating that he had one, and he took everybody on plane hostage, and he demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. After successfully obtaining these in Seattle, Washington, he ordered the plane to fly to Mexico. When they informed him that the plane didn't have enough fuel to fly to Mexico, they agreed upon Reno, Nevada. However, Cooper didn't stay on the plane that long. Instead, he jumped out, parachuting into the night, into the rain, into cloud cover, at some place over the Pacific Northwest. Maybe Seattle, maybe the Washington State, maybe Oregon, somewhere over the Pacific Northwest. Sorry if I said Seattle by mistake, I was thinking about Washington. And D.B. Cooper has never been seen or heard from again, to everybody's satisfaction. Now, one of the reasons why Bruce Smith stated that he wanted to write this book from the early parts of it is that there are about 70,000 pages of FBI files about the D.B. Cooper case. And I've noticed that there are 2 avenues that a lot of people use when they're trying to solve an unsolved mystery. And on Black Box Online Radio, I also talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and JonBenet Ramsey, and sometimes the Long Island Serial Killer. So, with unsolved mysteries, these are the methods that people use. Some people are all about the FBI files. They're all about the paper trail. They're all about the case file. They're like, you have to go through the documents, and you have to look at this statement that was made by a person, this observation that was made by an investigator. You have to look at this forensic material that was collected, and then you have to put it together. You have to take the facts from the reports, not just what other people say about them, but look at the paper trail and find out where it leads. That's one avenue that people use when they're trying to solve an unsolved case. Another one is they rely on storytelling, where they've obtained this confession from somebody, they suspect that this person may have been D.B. Cooper or one of the other serial killers that I mentioned, like the Zodiac Killer, and then they began to investigate that person. They try to eliminate them, they try to find supporting points and challenging points, and even though, from the way I said it, sounds like investigating the FBI files and the paper trail and the case file, that is definitely going to be a more fact-based approach. It's going to be a more conventional approach to solving a case. I don't think that the second one is completely baseless. What if somebody actually does make the right observations? What if they actually do suspect somebody, and there are reasons why they are suspicious of this person, and it turns out that those reasons are valid, and they actually have identified D.B. Cooper. But as far as this book goes, It is my understanding that Bruce Smith wanted to write this because he wanted to look at what happened with the FBI's investigation. He wanted to look at the documented experiences that people had while they were looking into the D.B. Cooper case. And even from the introduction, he openly states that he is not trying to solve the case and just say, okay, here's the perfect person of interest, here's the perfect suspect, voila, here is D.B. Cooper. Instead, he is just trying to approach this from a more historical perspective and a journalistic perspective, and looking at what happened with the FBI investigation. And from the beginning, we can just ask the challenge question. Everybody listening to Black Box Online Radio right now, why didn't D.B. Cooper get captured? Why didn't they find D.B. Cooper? Why has the case gone unsolved for so long? And this is something that is explored in the book. And Bruce Smith even offers two possibilities that he phrases as challenge questions to the reader. Number one, was D.B. Cooper too smart for the FBI? Interestingly, Bruce Smith does not seem to support that one, and I'm very, very much, well, I have a twofold response. The first one is, yes, I do think D.B. Cooper was very smart. I don't think that he was somebody who was just a bumbling oaf that just got away with this by the skin of his teeth. I don't think that D.B. Cooper was a goofball who was just joking around. Everything about D.B. Cooper seems like he is cool, calm, and collected, even though he is using certain vices to control himself, like sipping bourbon and soda and smoking cigarettes on the plane. But he didn't do that excessively. If anything, D.B. Cooper's trying to act like a businessman, and he's also trying to act very bland and very formal, not to draw attention to himself, even though he certainly did, because people would notice that he was interacting excessively with the flight attendants. But I think that D.B. Cooper was smart, and I also think that D.B. Cooper was very meticulous with his planning. I don't think he just made this up the night before and was like, all right, today's the day, I'm going to do it. Instead, I think D.B. Cooper put a lot of thought into his operations, the creation of the bomb or the dud, whatever was in the briefcase, as well as knowing where he was when he jumped, because I do think D.B. Cooper was able to estimate where he was. Excuse me if I said jumping over Seattle. I meant jumping over either Washington State or Portland, Oregon. And I think all of that is something that is going to be tied into the just the possible drop zone locations. And we don't necessarily know exactly where D.B. Cooper touched down, but it is always, always worth speculating. And I do think D.B. Cooper had a fairly good understanding of where he was, though. Last year on Cooper Friday, I had the opportunity to interview Pat Boland, who is perhaps one of the most active D.B. Cooper researchers on social media. And Pat Boland's been a guest on a lot of other programs, and she said two things, which I will come back to because I found them in Bruce Smith's book, D.B. Cooper and the FBI. The first is looking at how did D.B. Cooper get to the airport in Portland? How did he get there? Did he take a bus? Did he take a taxi? Was he given a ride by somebody? Did he ride a bicycle? Like, how did D.B. Cooper get to the airport? And what's actually just what Pat Boland said is she thinks that somebody drove D.B. Cooper. That would be the least conspicuous way of getting there. Maybe that person was even an accomplice. Maybe they were an unknowing accomplice. Unbeknownst to them, D.B. Cooper had planned the skyjacking. They didn't know what was in the briefcase or the mystery bag that D.B. Cooper was carrying. And the other thing, though, that is discussed in Bruce Smith's book that I wanted to mention is that the FBI did explore these leads. And her statement actually does seem to be supported by the book D.B. Cooper and the FBI, because what Bruce Smith does is he looks at how the FBI conducted numerous interviews in the Portland area of all types of people from all types of backgrounds, bus drivers, taxi drivers, servers in restaurants, just to see if anybody had recognized this individual, just to see if anybody was familiar with this person's appearance. Did they see D.B. Cooper before he got to the airport? And the problem is, though, as Bruce Smith writes, is that they did not know where to look. Yes, they can employ these types of methodologies, but they did not know where to look. Maybe D.B. Cooper did take a taxi to the airport, but that doesn't mean the FBI would know exactly which taxi to look for. Maybe he did take a bus, but that doesn't mean that they would know exactly which bus he was using at that exact time, and they could have, of course, gotten off the bus at an earlier stop and then walked a fair amount of distance to the airport. Again, the FBI did not know where to look for, but I do think that this should point to the fact that perhaps, as of now, I would also go with what Pat Boland stated, partnered with Bruce Smith's observations, and look at how D.B. Cooper most likely got to the airport with a ride from somebody. Somebody gave D.B. Cooper a lift in their own personal vehicle, or a vehicle that they were using at the time, and he did not take public transportation. And this ties into the next challenge question that was posed by Bruce Smith, and that is that, did the FBI just completely bungle the investigation, or did something else happen? Like, why didn't D.B. Cooper get captured? Did the FBI just completely bungle the investigation? And strangely, Bruce Smith seems to take the stance that no, they did not. And I found that to be very odd, because during the introductory statement in the book, he talks about how, number one, the FBI was extremely unorganized. They did not have a lot of communication among individuals, and at certain times, not even a single person is the absolute head of the D.B. Cooper investigations. And by Bruce Smith's own words, it was an almost every man for yourself mentality when people were looking at the D.B. Cooper case. And I don't mean to get political, but I just noticed this about humanity in general. If you have 10 people and you need to organize a project, or you need to get 10 people to do something, you're the manager, you're the leader, you're the team lead, and you want 10 people to do something, it can be very difficult. You can give out tasks, you can delegate, but then people can do sneaky things behind your back, people can cheat, and people can also try to obtain power. And this is a little bit of a diversion from D.B. Cooper, but I do think it's very relevant because we're looking at the FBI. This book is about how did the FBI respond to the D.B. Cooper case. And ultimately, that just seems like what happened. It was just very difficult to control this large amount of people, the FBI in its entirety, and that boiled down to the D.B. Cooper case. Or I should say that trickled down to the D.B. Cooper case. And ultimately, this is just showing that it was not as easy as it seems to just investigate Washington State, look around Washington State, I finally said the right place name, and then maybe they can look through the forest and look through the hills and the rivers and try and locate something D.B. Cooper related. Well, the investigations were actually very, very unorganized, and even though they're searching for D.B. Cooper with the SR-71 Blackbird, that doesn't mean that it was done well. According to the book D.B. Cooper and the FBI by Bruce Smith, they did not put agents into the forest or the woods until 40 hours after the skyjacking. D.B. Cooper jumped on Wednesday night, right? Thanksgiving Eve, the day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. And it states that not until Friday afternoon did they actually put agents into the woods. That means that D.B. Cooper would have had a 40-minute head start on the FBI, on anyone who was investigating him. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not using other methods, but putting agents into the woods, if D.B. Cooper survived the jump, and I do believe that D.B. Cooper did survive the jump, 40-hour head start, that's the entire investigation. So that sounds like the FBI actually did make several very, very critical errors. And this is the whole thing, because we have these two challenge questions, and, I mean, let's be clear about some things. I do think D.B. Cooper was smart. I do think that D.B. Cooper planned this. I think he planned it very well. But there is a certain amount of luck as to why D.B. Cooper was not captured. Number one, the book D.B. Cooper and the FBI even talks about this. One of the greatest errors that was committed was losing the cigarette butts. D.B. Cooper smoked at least 7 cigarettes on the plane, and the cigarette butts were lost. D.B. Cooper also left a hair behind on the headrest. The hair slide was lost. Now, it's quite possible that the hair slide could be found, and it's my understanding that the cigarette butts were most likely destroyed, but the hair slide should not have been destroyed. It's simply been lost or misplaced. D.B. Cooper did not know about DNA evidence back in 1971, so this just means that he was not aware of this. He got a little bit lucky that a lot of the important evidence was either mishandled, destroyed, misplaced, and that does mean that the FBI did make several very critical errors. No matter how smart D.B. Cooper was, he was also just pretty lucky. Let's be clear about that. And this is going to tie into another thing. I shouldn't have said that. This is going to tie into another thing because I wanted to talk to you about D.B. Cooper's tie. And there are a lot of, discussions about this online. I have an entire episode about D.B. Cooper's tie that I've done for Cooper Friday. And what I want to say is that I received an email after a recent episode of Cooper Friday where someone simply stated, "Ned, why do you keep talking about the tie? The tie is useless. It has been contaminated by so many different sources. It's just not what we need to solve the D.B. Cooper case." And I was so surprised that I said that because on recent episodes of Cooper Friday, I haven't been taking that stance. In fact, I've been saying a lot of things to the contrary, and I haven't been saying that the tie is the way to solve the D.B. Cooper case. I mean, my whole stance is that we don't have enough information about the tie to use it as the primary method to solve the D.B. Cooper case, because when you look at D.B. Cooper researchers, let's put this on a spectrum. You have some people like Eric Eulis who are going to state that the tie is the key. If you can't explain the tie, he's not the guy. That's what Eric Eulis has stated, because D.B. Cooper left behind his clip-on tie on the plane with a mother-of-pearl tie pin, on the clip-on tie, and when the tie was analyzed, it turned out it had over 100,000 microscopic particles, which contain very rare metals and elements, everything from titanium to aluminum to thorium to uranium. And Eric Eulis has stated that if you can't explain why this person had these elements on the tie, he's not the guy. If he did not have some type of occupation or reason to be around a facility that handled these elements, then he wasn't D.B. Cooper. That's the extreme end of one side of the spectrum. The extreme end of the other side would be someone saying something to the effect of that person who wrote me the email saying, no, the tie is useless, it's meaningless, it's not going to give you any answers. And where do I fall on that spectrum? Nowhere. I'm not in the middle, I'm not on either side. I'm somebody who's trying to look for a new battlefield, or a new battleground, if you will, and I'm saying that we don't know enough information about the tie right now to use it as a pathway to D.B. Cooper. Maybe it does have some valuable evidence, but I'm not even convinced completely that that was D.B. Cooper's tie. Although, after reading the early segments of the book, D.B. Cooper and the FBI by Bruce Smith, I do have to admit that perhaps it was. I mean, I'm not completely convinced, but mostly convinced that it was D.B. Cooper's tie. It's just that just because he has these metallic elements on the tie, it doesn't mean that he was the source of the metallic elements. The tie could have been borrowed, it could have been handled by somebody else, it could have, he could have come into contact with somebody else's facility. He could have been in a facility where he didn't work, but someone else worked and he was visiting them for an unknown reason. Whatever, there are just too many possibilities. And the most important thing to remember about this is that I said on a recent episode of Cooper Friday that the explanation that I like the most is that D.B. Cooper found the tie. And think about what I said though with how did he get to the airport, and these interviews that the FBI conducted about how they're interviewing bus drivers and even servers in restaurants. And I was like, what if D.B. Cooper found it on a bus or found it in a restaurant? Yes, I said that was the explanation that I liked the most, but that is purely for storytelling. I repeat, storytelling. I think that would make a good story, that D.B. Cooper found this on a chair in a restaurant. Hey, look, a tie. I'm wearing a suit. All right, I'm just going to put this on because, it's going to go with my suit. And that's why he left it behind on the plane, because it wasn't actually his tie. That is purely for the sake of storytelling. I don't have any way of supporting that. And, more likely than not, it was D.B. Cooper's tie, and he did dress himself that morning. Now, to the credit of Pat Bolin, she did post this on Facebook when someone asked the question, was D.B. Cooper married? And her response was, contrary to popular belief, D.B. Cooper was not wearing a black suit the way he's depicted in a lot of illustrations. He was actually wearing a brown or rust-colored suit. And she's like, I don't know what kind of guy would have a wife send him out of the house with a brown suit and a black tie, probably wasn't married. And you might think that that's just a joke, and it's halfway a joke, halfway serious. But when you focus on the halfway serious part, I do think that that's somewhat worthy of consideration. Women are going to pay attention to stuff like this, so that's why I think it's great to have a female presence in the vortex when they weigh in on how would women respond in that situation. Maybe Cooper wasn't married and he was a lifelong bachelor. Already certain suspects are coming to mind. One of them would be Kenny Christensen, and Kenny Christensen is the subject of the book Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins, and this is one that I've also done a book discussion about here on Cooper Friday. And I invite you guys to check that one out. And if you want to hear this show for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio, you can download it under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And if you want to support all of these efforts, in addition to hitting the like button and subscribing, you can also go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And of course, the absolute best way, though, is just by visiting some more content, more Cooper Friday episodes. And as I said, this is a book discussion. I also did one on Into the Blast, as well as The Trail to D.B. Cooper. And if there is another D.B. Cooper book that you would like to hear about for Cooper Friday, or anything D.B. Cooper related, you can always just put your suggestion in the comments section down below, and maybe it will be turned into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. So let's continue with the book discussion on D.B. Cooper and the FBI. Now, there's an individual that is mentioned in this book named Larry Carr, and he is the FBI agent who was assigned to the case. And Bruce Smith says that he had the opportunity to interview Larry Carr, and that Larry Carr was someone who acted like a bully toward him during the interview. And, of course, I was not present for that when it took place. However, Larry Carr also recently appeared on the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, which is run by Ryan Burns, and in that interview he definitely did not come across as a bully. Instead, he was someone who was actually taking a very skeptical standpoint. And Larry Carr is one of the few people who has followed the D.B. Cooper case from a professional point of view, but he is also one of the few people who believes that D.B. Cooper did not survive the jump, and he actually died either in the woods, maybe near Battleground, Washington, Orchards, Washington, not Seattle. No, sorry, I said that. I misspoke at the beginning. Not Portland either. I misspoke twice. But he believes that D.B. Cooper did not survive the jump. And I also had the opportunity to interview Jude Morrow, who is the author of the book Dan Cooper, and he was the subject of the most recent interviews here on Black Box Online Radio, and he also believes that D.B. Cooper died shortly after the jump. But a big difference between one of the conventional narratives that has been put forward by the FBI is they're saying maybe D.B. Cooper was a no-pull. He had a parachute that he obtained, but maybe he wasn't able to pull it because he was unable to do so because of the cold. But Jude Morrow took the stance of how he believed that D.B. Cooper would have been able to open the parachute, it's just that he would have died shortly after the jump. And some people even think that D.B. Cooper may have landed, but he might have been landing in a very rough way, and he would have been injured to a certain extent, and he's able to get through the woods, and he passes away because of the elements, he passes away because of his injuries, he passes away from dehydration, something to that effect. So that would mean that he wouldn't have passed away immediately where he landed. Whereas, I don't want to put words in Larry Carr's mouth, but it seemed like he was taking the stance of D.B. Cooper just landed, he hit the ground hard, and he's just stuck in a crater somewhere in Washington State, and people have been unable to locate where he is. And I just have never liked these statements, because I think, if anything, the fact that the agents didn't enter the woods until 40 hours after D.B. Cooper allegedly touched down, that shows that he would have had a lot of time to get away, and if anything, I think that supports the hypothesis that D.B. Cooper survived the jump. Another point that is discussed in the early sections of the book is there is a very famous statement that the FBI closed the D.B. Cooper investigation back in 2016, but the very, very first pages of D.B. Cooper and the FBI talk about how they are still accepting evidence. For starters, D.B. Cooper had $200,000 in $20 bills, and only $6,000 has been recovered from Tina Barr in 1980, so that means that the majority of the bills have not been found, and if somebody were ever to stumble upon bills that they think would be of use to the FBI in identifying D.B. Cooper, that type of evidence is welcome for submission. Another type of evidence that would be welcome for submission is D.B. Cooper's parachute, if they were indeed able to locate that. So that means that there are these types of back doors that exist within the D.B. Cooper investigation, and that means, to a certain extent, the D.B. Cooper case has not been completely closed, or if anything, the active investigations made by agents and task forces are not currently operating, but that does not mean that they won't follow up with leads that are going to be presented to them. So it's almost as if it's only active if they have a very good reason to restart it. And as you see already, we've talked about so many different subjects just from the beginning of this book, D.B. Cooper and the FBI, and it's connected to many other different aspects of the case. It's very easy to take a book like this and connect it to the observations that have been made by other researchers and sleuths, and you heard some of them entered into this episode. So I would just like to say, do you have any responses to any of the comments that I have made? And do you have any responses to the comments made by Bruce Smith, author of the book D.B. Cooper and the FBI? And you can always put your ideas in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and there is also BlackboxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And this week on Black Box Online Radio, there will be a bonus episode coming out about the Long Island serial killer. To anyone who's listening to this as it comes out live, you can check that out tomorrow. And if you're listening to this in the future and you're curious about the Long Island serial killer case, you can visit some of the content here on BBOWAR. All for me now, until next time.